I see my work as an extension of myself, like as a series of events and experiences and observances that I've had and still have. Always, of course, in reference to social cultural issues like folklore, music. Those are things that influence a lot of my work. Language, poetry, the domestic space, furniture especially. I grew up seeing a lot of cane furniture making, and so that has a marker on me as well. And also issues that relate to the human identity and the body and all that. So I pick these, each work is a moment in time that I've experienced or seen or observed that I'm trying to replicate how I feel at that moment that it's being made. Almost all of them have to do with my growing up experiences, especially with my immediate family and extended family. I see it also as a way of storytelling because my grandmother was a very good storyteller. She used to tell lots of stories. So I grew up with that storytelling culture. Both of my parents come from the eastern part of Nigeria, but I was born and brought up in Benin City because my parents live there and still live there, and that's Midwest. Nigeria, of course, is a petroleum producing country, and plastic is a product of petroleum. And so I work with plastic bags, predominantly non-biodegradable plastic bags and occasionally bottles, because the ideology of waste, in the past, in our cultural history, is almost considered sacrilegious because it's not an ethical and as well as cultural thing to do, because everything had a place, everything had value, was very important in our communities, which meant that every object had a place or function that it performed. And I would say reincarnation in object was always inherent. I felt that plastic became a serious problem because packaging, for instance, is a very strong part of the capitalist industrial society, and packaging, of course, relies heavily on plastic. In the past, packaging was using natural organic things that you can easily discard, and they would, nature would generally take care of itself. And so I felt like plastic became a problem because we were used to, reflectively just throwing things and then knowing that it would take care of itself, and throwing plastic thinking it will take care of itself, not realizing that it will not take care of itself. And so I grew up seeing a lot of that become an environmental problem. I went into plastic as an environmental response, but then over the process of experimenting this, I realized I really wanted to take this on, and then shifted into sculpting because that was originally my intent, to be a sculptor and not a painter. And then shifted into it and began to nourish and develop and understand this material that I was working with, as well as the reasons why I was creating what I was creating, which is basically in response to my experiences as an individual in a community, in a society, interactions with the environment and outside the environment, and just getting to understand what materiality really means, especially non-tangible material, because you can see there are non-tangible elements incorporated in terms of the process and technique that I use, which is, for instance, hair threading, and that's major that I use in my sculptures. Threading is actually a beautiful hair architecture where the natural hair is partitioned into sections, and then these sections are wrapped with a special thread, mercerized cotton thread. It was something I grew up with. It was a natural fashion for us. It was always fascinating how they were able to sculpt, because it actually was hair sculpture, how they were able to sculpt elaborate, sometimes very detailed, intricate hairstyles and just one small piece of head. I used to do a lot of hair threading on my hair and also for others. And when I couldn't do that, especially for my younger sister, I would thread anything that I found around me. I had always been doing this construction with hair threading on the side, but never taking it as the real deal. I was focused on the painting, my painting experiment with plastic. It was not until later that it finally hit me, like, that's actually the thing I was supposed to be doing. And besides, that's the sculpture. This is not the sculpture that I always wanted to do. And so my understanding when I was started in the early stages of my practice was that I was upcycling. That was the term I was told. And so I adopted that terminology as what I was doing. I was an upcycle artist, and I took it really serious to know what I was doing. But then when I was reading through and trying to understand this, I realized, I don't think that's actually what I'm doing. And also because upcycle focuses only on the physical material object. And my practice incorporates both the material and immaterial, the tangible and intangible. The intangible being the threading, and the tangible being the plastic and the wood and plastic bottles and any other material I incorporate. And I felt that's not the terminology. I have to redefine what it is I'm doing. And besides, I'm taking back a practice that has always existed in my culture. And so now I refer to it as neo-traditionalism. The term traditional for me doesn't necessarily refer to something that only happens in the past, but it refers in terms of what the trend of the moment. We use it mostly, especially in artistry. It was always used as to create a disparity between what happened in the past and what's happening now. So traditional, contemporary. And it never made sense to me because traditional is actually contemporary, because contemporary means what's happening now. Traditional was the contemporary of that time. So I saw myself going back to the contemporary of that time, but using, so it's new because I'm using a material that is of this era. Plastic was not of that era. And so I refer to it now as neo-traditionalism. I'm not a very patient person. My mom used to say, you're not very patient, but you're hyper patient with your work. It takes me a very long time because my work is very procedural and it involves a lot of craft. And we all know that craft, especially by hand, it's a labor of love. It takes months, weeks, sometimes years. And the bulk of the work is actually threading. Making the sculpture doesn't take me that long. It's actually threading the bags that takes me a while. For someone, having 100 bags is like a lot. For me, having 100 bags is like, oh, I've just braided two plasto yarns and that's it. And that doesn't make much for me, or almost nothing. So it takes a very long time. I know what it is I want to create in my head, but because I do not want to draw it out, the way to encourage myself to start drawing it out is to start off with a circle, and I build off from that circle. The circle is symbolic for me because I see the circle as a continuum. I chose that title, Ozuhezu, which translates to it's not enough. Incomplete will be the next closest thing, because every time I make a piece, I have to cut it short. I have to cut the potentiality of the work existing beyond whatever point it is because of time. And so when I was invited to do the show, I felt what would be most appropriate to title the show but that, because I've always wanted to make a piece that was huge, but I never had the place or the time to create such a piece. And I wanted to do that here. And I also noticed that in my observance of how art is presented in an institution or presented in general, it's always a create, finish, tidy up, place on a pedestal, objectified. And I always used to feel like I was never able to completely complete a sculptural piece the way that I would have wanted it, just because I have to conform to what is needed at the moment. So this work was supposed to be that moment where I said, why should I have to keep creating work that has to stop? Why should the value of that work be cut? And so I wanted to create a work that continued. It was a collaboration between me and the Baltic community, so to speak. So their donation of the bag added to the effect of the extension, the growth of the work. So the more communities I interact with, the more the work will continue to grow. And so this piece becomes that piece for me where I'm almost trying to redefine how art should be perceived and how art should be presented. Most especially as an African woman or a Nigerian woman, you're expected to talk about certain issues, expected to present yourself, especially now that everybody's under, there's this sudden craze for contemporary African art. And I always used to wonder, you do know that has always been existing. It didn't just suddenly start. And there's an expectation where people want you to talk about hair, the black body, the Africanness and all that. Those things are inherent, but I deliberately do not speak about them because I feel there is more to me than just that, and you have to start looking at that. And so I'm just telling stories with my work. I'm just creating things and choosing to share them at moments that present itself.